Good afternoon, everyone. You know, there's this cliche which says that the speaker who follows needs no introduction, right? I mean, this is the place where this cliche really works. You know, he needs no introduction, so I'm not going to say anything about Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, except that he's been a great source of encouragement for us at Takshashila, both through the work which he does and also through the encouragement which he actively extends to us, including the form of joining us here today in spite of the many things which happen in Delhi. So without further ado, this is the second cliche, without further ado. Usually when they say without further ado, there's a 5-minute speech which follows. But in my case, there's no further ado. I just hand over the floor to Pratap and wish you a very engaging afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Nitin. You know, it's always intimidating to sort of be associated with any Takshashila event. I mean, this is such a wonderful institution, and congratulations to all the people you know, who made it possible. It's also a bit intimidating to be here, partly because you know we've heard some wonderful speakers this morning. But from what I gather, you as a group are also sort of, you know, so exciting and interesting. And what I hope to do in this session is basically just more try and learn from you as much as sort of, you know, instruct you. I'm not sure that instruction is possible. Nitin gave me a mandate about what I should speak, and it was one of those nicely broad mandates on, you know, things that will influence public policy. And the two challenging things when one's thinking about that mandate is, one, it's very broad, and two, it's not clear that many of us believe that there is something called public policy, or what that thing is. So what I thought I'd do, and the way we perhaps structure this session, is do it in reverse. First, open the floor to you, and invite a few questions from you. In terms of, I'd just like to get a sense of what's on your mind, what puzzles, questions, anxieties, when you think of, right, what kinds of things might actually affect the public policy process. And part of the point is to just, in some ways, in a very brief way, try and get to know you. I mean, I know it's faking knowing you to get you to sort of, you know, ask a 2-minute question or comment, but also perhaps to sort of then try and kind of structure your presentation in some senses that responds to some of your interests, because I think the challenge in any group like this is I have very little sense of, you know, both what interests you, and obviously your commitment is very clear, the fact that you are here. But also the first principle of, I guess, kind of good dialogue is to sort of see where people are situated, you know, what their sense is. So let me just maybe open it up for, you know, just briefly. And if I were to turn around and ask you, when you look ahead or contemplate the current moment, what are the puzzles or anxieties or what are the things that perhaps get you mad? And maybe, you know, we can try and resolve some of those anxieties at this moment. So just open the floor, and if you could just, you know, I mean, your names are very clear, but just kind of say where you're from or something. So perhaps you can begin with that. Who wants to go first? Some question that's bugging you. It's really nice for us to discuss it right now in relation to public policy or something. Can't be because I said.
Hi, my name is Sachin. I'm a journalist from Mumbai. What I wanted to ask, and I've been asking, you know, many policy analysts the same question, but and all of them told me there's no clear answer for this. Where does policy making end and where does politics begin? Because there'll always be conflict between policy and politics. And how do you resolve this you know, incongruity between the two?
Okay.
In public policy, and especially in our course, we have been talking a lot about the multiple stakeholder problem, and there are so many stakeholders that you need to resolve, etc. But what's been bugging me a little bit is that the process of policy is so slow do we have, as a country, have the patience to go through it, and how will that play out, and what will the impatience cause? That's an example.
Okay.
My question is like we are known to have a huge young population right now, and we have a deadline before which they might turn against the system. So, are policymakers in this country even thinking in that direction? Other than other constraints, we have a time constraint also.
My concern is, so far as policy making goes, at least these days there seem to be several groups, be it what calls itself a civil society group, which at least to me sometimes appears misinformed, but yet seem to have punching above their weight so far as the public discourse goes. So I think it eats into a lot of policy time, if I may use that term, perhaps diverting attention from things that need far more attention.
My name is Pratap. I had them from Chennai, so might not be relevant. How do people make politicians take responsibility for the kind of policies that they pass? That's one. And the other is how to avoid tit-for-tat policy making. Like, for example, one government comes in, it passes a law, the next government comes in, it overturns it. I mean, just with regard to the Chennai, this thing, I mean, the metro and the monorail, they've been going on and off for ages together. How to make that strong?
A couple more. And then there'll be, for those of you who haven't spoken, there'll be another chance. Yeah. And then
Hi, my name is Pawan. The question I had is about public policies that aren't necessarily populist. There's usually a price to be paid, there's discomfort to be experienced. So how do we, especially in India, go about doing this, where it's for the greater good of for good in the future?
So there's always this kind of loop actually. Politicians say that this is the way voters are voted, and voters say that this is the way politicians are when we don't have any other alternative. And politicians say this is the way voters, I mean, they respond to freebie, so we give it freebie. So where do you end this? Where do we end this deadlock, and how do we go about it?
okay. Maybe one last one. Or okay, why don't we just collect all of them? That'll be easier. Yeah. Go ahead. You're all actually all asking the same question, so it makes my life easier. But anyway.
Basically, sir, I rather fear for the future of our country if we analyze the trend in political movement. Sometimes I feel that we are actually regressing in our policies. The politics of entitlement is becoming more and more powerful. In 50-60 years, it should have been the reverse. So I'd like to ask you, what is the reason for that, and how do we get out of this predicament?
Two questions. First is, how can we increase the percentage of voting? And second thing is, why are in policies, there's a huge gap of policies to reach the marginalized. So why is it happening?
My name is Rohit Pandey. I am from, I belong to the city of Lucknow. I am from UP. And my question is very specific in that context, that as youngsters who want to bring about a positive change, how do we, given our own constraints, make the maximum possible impact in changing the political narrative? Because my understanding is that the policy is secondary to politics.
Okay. Maybe one last one. Or actually, I'll come to you.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm from Nagpur. I wanted to know, like, there are these buzzwords flying around: sustainability, development, and there are effective ideas being built around it. So how do you gauge the future of these, these words, these sentiments, these ideologies playing out in the future, in the policy domain? Can we actually strengthen it, or will it just be a passing fad?
My question.
Mic.
My name is Sarah. My question is, For example, when as policymakers you come up with ideal policies on paper which are even being implemented. For example, if you look at the National Rural Health Mission, on paper it's a pretty good policy, and in most of the states it's being implemented well and the outcomes have been positive. But then if you look at the implementation in states like UP and all the politics and the crime that's going behind it, how do you, as policymaker, how do you influence the implementation of an ideal policy on paper and take it forward once it's gone to the government sector? Is there any power you have to influence that?
My question is public policy. We have multiple stakeholders, like in a corporate situation as well. So can we draw parallels between the corporate policy setting and the public policy, and can we carry the learnings of the corporate policy into the public policy?
Okay, that's a big menu, and it's a coincidence actually. I was going to speak just about these questions. So rather than kind of just answer them one by one, let me kind of just step back and perhaps for the next 5 or 7 minutes, maybe give you a little bit of a framework which might address this question. I mean, and the framework is really more about trying to understand where we are located at this moment in our history, what's happening to government and politics. Both that, these kinds of questions are being asked, but is there an internal dynamic to these changes that are going on that may actually answer some of your questions, right? Now, I think one way of thinking about it, and this is not particularly original, but sometimes kind of the basics are helpful, is at the moment I think we have 3 revolutions going on at the same time, right? In relation to politics and governance, right? And the 3 revolutions can be described in the following terms. Right? The first is, I would argue, an administrative revolution in the making. Okay? And if one were to simply characterize it, this is a gross oversimplification, but hopefully it will be analytically useful. Government traditionally has been founded on 3 premises, the administrative machinery. The first is hierarchy, right? So there's a hierarchy in government, there's senior people, junior people, more senior people, there are bureaucrats, politicians above them. But there was a specific sense to that hierarchy, namely that hierarchy meant you were accountable to the people above you, right? And by and large, if you look at the Indian state, its notion of accountability was always vertically upwards. My boss will ask me something. Joint secretary says, my secretary will say, secretary will say, my minister, right? So the primary accountability you were concerned was in a sense that vertically upward hierarchy, right? The second premise of most government and administration, and I think in retrospect it's amazing how much we don't realize this change, was secrecy. Secrecy not in the sense that government always kept secrets, but this massive asymmetry of information between government and the citizen. Right? On all kinds of very quotidian things like how much budget has been sanctioned. Colleagues at CPR are doing this PESA report. It's actually incredible how difficult it is to even trace money in the government system. Right? So there was a sense of secrecy. I'm using the word secrecy loosely, but government could manipulate, hog on to information in ways in which allowed it to both exercise power, but also hide things. Right? And the third was, broadly speaking, a broad arena of discretion. Right? So standard stories, we elect our representatives are supposed to make choices, and they exercise discretion in making those choices, and if we don't like them, we vote them out every 5 years. Right? Now, at one level, a lot of the noise that you see at the moment, and the civil societies, what you think is kind of obstructionist civil society, at some level is a yearning for overturning these 3 principles. Right? So instead of hierarchical accountability, we are looking at some form of lateral accountability, either to citizens or to co-equivalent institutions within the government. Right? So now you fear not just the Prime Minister of India, you probably fear the CAG more, or the Supreme Court more. I mean, God knows who can throw an accountability wrench in your plans, right? But also if you look at the grassroots, I mean, if you actually think of what citizens movements are asking, right? Citizens charters, you know, Panchayati Raj, devolution, there's a whole concatenation of things we are asking for. Some of them are wise, some of them are pretty silly and unimplementable. But the underlying aspiration that unifies all of that is answer to me, don't answer to your boss, don't answer to somebody above you, right? And I think, I mean, I am actually quite hopeful. I mean, I think at the moment it seems like administrative chaos, but I think that practice of governance will have to shift irrevocably. We are not quite sure how to design those forms of lateral accountability, you know, how to design a citizens charter where people, you know, where the bureaucrat is incentivized to actually answer to you rather than, you know, answer to some other authority. But I think the fact that we are thinking along those lines, to me, is a very hopeful sign. I mean, it's in the midst of revolution, there'll be a lot of confusion, but I think this is something for changing fundamentally. The fact that you are asking these questions. Right? Second issue, secrecy, right? Now, obviously the right to information, you know, at one level is one manifestation of the fact that citizens are being empowered. And don't underestimate the power of the Right to Information Act. I mean, you know, one of the things, if you see the other scam files, it's very evident that it's just the files are written by people who never thought anybody would see this stuff. I mean, forget whether, you know, there was wrongdoing or not, right? Think of what would happen 5, 10 years from now. And I think you're beginning to see this in government already, where, you know, at one level you're seeing a culture of avoidance at the moment, right? Nobody wants to take responsibility because you will be held responsible and caught out, right? But the flip side of it, right, is that the fear of exposure is actually beginning to kick in a little bit, right? Okay. So we are also in this, and the asymmetry between civil society and state on information, a capacity to mobilize knowledge, that's also shifting, right? The third one, which is more problematic in some ways, I mean problematic to conceptualize, is our common understanding in popular politics at the moment is discretion is bad, right? Discretion is what allows politicians to do arbitrary things, right? They can allot land this way, they can, you know, give goodies to whoever they want, all kinds of, right? So we need some rule-based system that takes away more and more and more discretion, right? Now, the trouble, I mean, Professor Asher can tell you, you know, more analytically, but the right balance between rules and discretion is not that easy to design, right? And sometimes we err in the wrong direction. But I think the fact that there is a suspicion of discretionary power, right? While it seems debilitating again in the short run, again take a bit of historical perspective, right? It is part of that accountability movement. So the first proposition I want to submit to you that as much as things seem, you know, sort of paralyzed at one level, right? I think in part that paralysis is being produced by, let's say, some deep good changes that are happening in how we think of ourselves and what we expect from government. Now the problem is, of course, that this overturning of this old order is colliding with the old reality of government, right? Which is, and currently every incumbent in power has not just an incentive to try and conduct government the same old way, right? But even if you can convince them for change, their biggest fear is they're all going to be caught out, right? In this moment, right? I mean, you cannot imagine, even the most honest civil servant is scared at the moment. You don't know how they could be. In fact, honest ones are even more scared, right? Usually they are, because they're easier targets at one level. So in part, the response of the state, and I think the political system, we'll talk about politics in a minute, is to try and negotiate this revolution by displacing responsibility, by not taking decisions, by, you know, he did it, so-and-so's responsibility. Nobody wants to claim authority in a system where you're suddenly not clear who you're accountable to. Are you accountable to your minister? Are you accountable to the CAG? Are you accountable to the Supreme Court? Are you accountable to the media? Right? You have a culture of reason giving within government right? That was largely premised on secrecy of a certain kind, right? And, transparency can also have its limits. The demand for information can go too far, and we can talk about that. But fundamentally, what does it mean to govern where you can no longer assume that anything you say or do will be kept secret, right? What noting do you write, right? Now, very few people in government, I think they understand this is the zeitgeist of the future, this is going to happen 5 years from now, 6 years from now. But I think they're not quite, it's still hard to internalize all of this in the practice of government, right? And this discretion versus rules again, so because there's a suspicion of discretion, either nobody wants to exercise power. A lot of the good people don't want to exercise power because they say, tomorrow we'll have to explain ourselves under what rule you did it, right? Or you come up with silly rules, right? To take away discretion that some places where they're not appropriate, right? So one way of thinking about this, and I actually think of it in hopeful ways. I know we are sort of, often write very critical stuff, but criticism, I think, based on the possibility of change, right? That you have these two administrative orders colliding. Devolution, Panchayati Raj, another kind of instance of it. Now, at one level, right, Mayati's argument is that when you decentralize, you are actually going to see a rise in corruption initially. And one indication of this is the fact that, look at, for example, the money that's now involved in Panchayat polls. 50, 60 lakhs in Panchayat elections is not unheard of now, right? But, right, you could make the argument that without that devolution, you had absolutely no chance of instituting any kind of lateral accountability, creating any kind of minimal framework for inclusive governance. If you have to go to the state capital to have a traffic light changed, forget it, right? And the Home Secretary is answerable to a Home Minister, right? So, I think we are at this moment where we are beginning to see the delegitimization of that old structure, the principles that underlay it. And these were very explicit principles. It's amazing how Government of India was structured like a colonial state. Right? And, so yes, civil society has got a lot of things wrong, but I think it's an expression of just that. So that's one administrative kind of story. Right? What makes our task more challenging at the moment and why we have this sense of paralysis is that there's a parallel political story going on as well, right? And the political story is much harder to describe, or even simplify what's going on in our politics, right? What's the basis of legitimacy, right? But there are 4 or 5 trends that seem to be clear at the moment, right? The first is clearly the fragmentation of power in Indian society and Indian politics. And we've been talking about it a lot since the decline of the Congress thesis, in post 1980s, right? The interesting question to ask is whether this fragmentation of power that we are seeing at the moment, is it a passing phase, or is there something intrinsic about the form of parliamentary democracy that we have, right? And the kinds of mobilizations we are getting in terms of what people want? Or is it a passing phase, or is this likely to be a fairly permanent feature of our politics? Right? Now, one way of thinking about it, so is again, this is a huge simplification, but one way of thinking about it is in the following ways. My own sense is that I think for various historically contingent reasons, we've not quite woken up to the fact that we are a federal parliamentary democracy until very recently. What do I mean by that, right? If you look at the Congress, the days of Congress hegemony, right, till the mid-60s, 1967, let's say that, kind of one-party dominance, right? That was built on a whole range of things. In part, that was, of course, built on, decades of mass mobilization as a nationalist party in the nationalist movement, right? That's what Nehru could count on to give him legitimacy. Plus, of course, the difficulties of organizing collective action in India against any centralized force, right? You got that opening up in the late 60s, right? Interesting counterfactual, if 1971 hadn't happened, right? Where would we have been in terms of the evolution of the party system? 71, we lurched through crisis to crisis. I mean, in some senses, the emergency, backlash. Again, the fragmentation opens up, but it completely collapses. Indira Gandhi comes back. Assassination, Rajiv comes to power on the wave of another deep national crisis. Right? You look at the BJP, you look at Atal Bihari Vajpayee, at least the NDA period, and you know, whatever you think of that government. It is incredible in retrospect. It took almost 40 years of presence in mass politics for Atal Bihari Vajpayee to be acknowledged as a national leader. Right? So you could say that most of the last kind of 40-45 years, we have been implicitly thinking of our democracy as both having not just a dominant party, but somehow centered around dominant figures. Right? Nehru, Vajpayee, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, right? In some ways, it's a sign of good health that barring a real national crisis, because in times of crisis you rally around, you know, you do various things. We are actually now just a genuinely federal parliamentary democracy, right? Nobody's writ can run easily across the country. Right? But one of the interesting things that challenges that's showing up for all political parties, not just the Congress, is the paradox right now, which is what it takes to consolidate power in a particular locality, in a particular state, is not enough to catapult you to making you a national leader. Right? In fact, when Nitish Kumar says, look, if I leave Bihar, I don't know what will happen to my base after me, right? It's a genuine dilemma, right? I mean, you have lots of state chief ministers who in some senses have a quote-unquote mass base or something, right? But in a parliamentary system, they're not going to be able to make that transition very easily, right? To national status without having to negotiate with 25 other big bosses. So if NDA is to be put together right now, it'll have to be, 10-15 chief ministers basically figuring out who's acceptable to them. Congress has historically solved this problem. I mean, Congress. I think part of what happens with the Gandhi family is that the regional bosses always cancel each other out because politicians are suspicious of each other, right? Right? So the Gandhi family, as a kind of, figures from nowhere, solve their coordination problem at some level. If you were to give it a rational kind of cast, right? But no political party historically has had structures of creating leadership that actually recognize this reality. Right? Either it was dynastic, some historical inheritance which you capitalized on in the case of the Congress Party, in the BJP, some sense of acceptability to the RSS plus compulsions of coalition politics, you put up an acceptable face. But it's never institutionalized the system. What would you actually do if you got 15 chief ministers to negotiate who your prime minister should be? Right? Now, again, the good news may be that the parties are actually beginning to recognize this. I mean, what happened to the BJP in Karnataka, after they realized there's no other way of resolving this crisis but by instituting a procedure, right? Let the electors decide. That it's very hard to see India functioning or any political party being able to function without having a modicum of that in the future. I mean, Congress, Uttarakhand is paying the price for not doing it, right? So the challenge for us is that I think, although our democracy was parliamentary, we never acted as if it were a parliamentary democracy. We acted as if it were a presidential system of government, right? Rahul Gandhi, who's the prime minister, right? Frankly, the Prime Minister now will have a very different route to negotiated legitimacy, right, than Jawaharlal Nehru or Indira Gandhi or somebody else did, right? So in that sense, there's great fragmentation of power, but again, we don't have the right institutional response within the space of political parties to respond to this fragmentation, right? I mean, they're still kind of groping in a sense, the dark. The second sense in which power is being fragmented, and this is just more speculative, the first I can kind of perhaps defend in story, but is, so I've been looking, some colleagues at CPR have been looking at urban politics in India, municipal corporation politics, right? Hyderabad, Mumbai, and just asking the question, who are these politicians? Who actually wins office? Who runs? I mean, you know, you have the kind of data Association for Democratic Reforms puts out, you know, which is really about their income levels and, you know, they're all crorepati's and all of that stuff. I mean, that's useful up to a point, but just who are these people? What are their trajectories, right? And one thing that is beginning to emerge, and I think it's beginning to emerge in rural India as well to a certain extent, actually perhaps to even greater extent, is for 40-50 years since independence, you had politicians that were largely socially embedded politicians, right? Particular caste group, you're the big Jat leader, you know, you're the big family, whatever that story is, right? It had the downside that, you know, you had the advantage of that family inheritance or whatever. The upside was that you had politicians embedded in local contexts whose primary function was to do local political negotiation, right? Keep the peace in our constituency between the Jats and the Meenas. I mean, you know, essentially the politicians saw themselves as primarily a social glue, right? We have a very limited set of tasks, which is to somehow negotiate these local conflicts in a way in which they actually don't become really violent, real conflicts. Well, that's basically how politicians saw their function. Now what's happening is two things simultaneously. One, that more and more politicians are not embedded in those contexts, even though they are families in a traditional sense, you know, and the Indian political system is still relatively closed, right? You can think of sort of, you know, all the data on hereditary tendencies in India. But the source of their legitimacy now at the local level is less the fact that they were socially embedded. You know, I'm the big Jat leader or whatever. There's an element to that, but the element of legitimacy now comes from something slightly odder and different, which is they are more like entrepreneurs than they are like social glues. And they are like entrepreneurs in 3 or 4 senses. One, again, this was historical to the 70s and 80s as well in southern Indian states. You see the state, right, as largely a means for business mobility. That's still true by and large of most politicians. Okay? And if you look at Bombay Municipal Corporation, it's amazing. I mean, most of them are contractors, actually, as it turns out, right? And it's the kind of phenomenon you got in Andhra 15, 20 years ago. And there used to be a line where contractors didn't become politicians. Now contractors actually enter politics themselves and want to become MPs, right? So there's an entrepreneurial element to this. And the way you create legitimacy for yourself is actually, again, not by claiming that social embeddedness, but using this entrepreneurial craft to do something, you know, whether it's distribute money, distribute goodies, whatever it is, right? Some do it better, some do it worse, right? But there is a big challenge in this, which is as politics becomes more entrepreneurial in this way, at one level there's a possibility that it becomes a much more open space as well. Although, because of the sheer logistics and I think what it takes to, you know, run an election, I think the entry barriers are still very high. It's not the fact, there's the fact that parties are closed systems and so forth. But you know, if you come down to it, you ever watch an election campaign, if you just go around, you just really wonder how high the skill entry barrier for entry politics is. I think we always underestimate that. I mean, it's an incredibly tough job, right? I mean, just from everything from body language, the way you relate to people. So there is that, you know, that component. But the point is that, and this is the big challenge, which is, if your representatives become more entrepreneurs of this kind, right, does their capacity for local conflict mediation diminish or increase? At the moment, it seems to not matter as much because in part, you don't have those kind of precipitating polarizing conflicts. But you can't now rely on your MP to have the authority to do the kind of transmission function of explaining stuff that you used to be. So, think of Jawaharlal Nehru's practice, right? Letters to Chief Minister. It's an amazing practice, right? I mean, when you think of it, every 2 to 3 weeks writing letters to Chief Ministers, explaining why I'm starting a university, why I'm doing this, why we're doing this with China, and then, somehow that kind of gets transmitted down the line, right? Most MPs don't have that look because they're being judged on, in a sense, entrepreneurial skills, right? Okay. So even at a local level, your capacity to negotiate difference may diminish, particularly in a context where now you of course expect a lot more things from government, right? I mean, 15, 20 years ago, basically, there were 3 or 4 basic demands, right, that express themselves politically. Now everything will express itself politically. I mean, you want everything from sustainable development to, schools, universities, colleges, that's the rising, right? So you have that kind of, if you might say, kind of political fragmentation, again, where in a hyper-mobilized context, where institutions are not yet responding, your party structures are not responding, right? They don't have a way of understanding and incorporating this fragmentation. And the third and final thing that's happening, which I'll sort of perhaps kind of at the risk of provoking you, put it this way, is you have actually a genuine knowledge confusion in our society and practices of policy. What do I mean by knowledge confusion? So I think somebody asked the question, I think it's Sachin, about, is there a distinction between policy and politics, right? I actually will stay up front. I don't think there is, and I don't think there should be. I mean, people say, do politicians listen to think tanks? I'd be actually very worried if they did, to be very honest. I mean, look, there is no decision that does not involve a trade-off, right? So in that sense, no decision is a value-neutral decision, right? I think the important thing is to be very clear about why you made a choice in the way you did. But that is the politician's prerogative, right? And I'd be very worried if we were a society where we said policy should be sequestered from people arguing about these distributional questions and so forth. I think the more important thing is whether it's done more intelligently and how you do it, and I'll come to that. But the knowledge confusion in society is the following, and frankly, I think one of the things being in Delhi, I'm beginning to notice kind of more and more is the following, which is all societies have disagreements, right? And there will always be. In a society like India, where the range of social experience is so vast, there will be serious disagreements. As you also know, disagreements often have to do more with moral psychology than they have to do with the truth of propositions. It's, what do you fear most, rather than, what the truth actually is, right? And in that sense, the diversity of social experiences, right, will create those differences. I mean, often people can actually agree on purely abstract knowledge propositions, right? But they disagree on judgment calls, or do I trust the state or do I not trust the state, right? Now that's not something that is very easy to resolve through our rational enlightenment, evidence-based policy making. You can point out, you can say, no, but the state has failed here, state has failed here, state has failed here, and the guy comes back and says, but you know what? I think if the state goes to be even worse, right? So, at one level, our conceptualization and articulation of our differences actually has a lot more to do with these embedded premises than with actually debates over evidence, right? And we don't have ways to actually talk through those very, very clearly. And part of it is also because, in some senses, going back to the fragmentation and entrepreneurial style of politics, is a lot of conversations are made possible by credibility. I mean, there's a kind of, in Indian texts, I used to always be struck by this, this claim that you have to have Shraddha in order to learn, right? And Shraddha means a basic sense of trust. I mean, not reverence, but a basic, right? The point is, when you are in an equilibrium where institutions and knowledge structures don't have that basic credibility, it's much harder to mediate these conversations, even in a purely knowledge space, right? So So, I mean, let's just take the nuclear safety debate, for example, right? Now, no matter what your views on it, the fact is, if you're operating in a context where people don't trust the state, why do you trust the state's data, or why do you trust the state's assurances? You and I can have a scientific argument, we can trot out all the scientists on the earth we want, saying this is safe, this is safe, this is safe. And the guy turns and says, look, you tell me not to trust PDS, you tell me not to trust public schools, you tell me not to trust hospitals, now you tell me to trust government scientists, right? In fact, I think a lot of that disagreement is almost at that level, actually of, I think Nehru said of Gandhi, right, that his genius in politics was he would do psychotherapy. His genius was not right. That ability is actually pretty rare now. It's very hard for, and that's why when we say why, if you honestly ask the question, you said, somebody asked this question about what can we do to improve politics. My counter question is, why should anybody trust you? Right? If you went down and go, said, I'm standing from Lucknow for MP, if somebody said, who are you? You might say, well, I'm a very committed guy, I'm a very honest guy, I have bright ideas, right? But think of it from their point of view, right? How do they place you in a context where they can say, looks trustworthy, right? So part of our knowledge crisis is almost at that level, right? Where I think because you have this very complex social experiences, people are refracting things. I mean, I'll give you another example from personal sort of, thing. I'm centrally involved in the reservations debate, for example. And I'm for strong forms of affirmative action, though not reservation. We can go into that nuances. But one of the things I always used to be puzzled by, just as a political fact, is, at the time of independence, there was this consensus that no matter which way you cut it, Dalits required special attention. I mean, on any criteria of oppression, marginalization, right? And no matter what you thought the objective of affirmative action was, whether it's to create a middle class, whether it's equal opportunity, whether it's just getting a share of power, whatever your picture of affirmative action, Dalits are one group that should be included in it. What happened gradually was, of course, more and more groups appropriated the narrative. And the big puzzle is, being a Yadav was not quite the same as it was, had the same social valence as being a Chamar, yet for public policy purposes they got completely assimilated, right? There's the same narrative. We also know that on the ground, the SP-BSP divide in UP is probably deeper than the BJP-BSP divide, right? Manuwad is not an issue in UP politics, right? Yes. Yet, interestingly, right? So I used to ask, Dalit activists and politicians, why do you support this extension of affirmative action, reservation? And the answer always used to be, if we don't do this, we will again become powerless and benefits given even to Dalits will be taken away. So while we understand these points, that there's a distinction between, very rough categories, but there's a distinction between OBCs and Dalits, that their narrative of oppression is not the same as ours, their economic situation is not the same as ours. But, right, it's a kind of thin end of the wedge, right? If we say rationalizes to only those who deserve it, that's the thin end of the wedge of all of them. Now, how do you deal with an argument like that? Right? This is not an argument straightforwardly about evidence in a kind of, in a technical data sense, right? It's a political judgment call, where effectively they are saying, yes, we understand your data, right? We just don't trust you. Right? Or if you stand up and say, scholarships, education, they stand up and say, boss, 50 years we haven't got that. Why should we trust that you will give us that? Right? So the fundamental problem when you're talking about kind of entering politics, making change, is that how is it that you're able, on what basis do you project that credibility? Right? think of the only people who've risen in mass politics in the last few years, right? Mamta, Mayawati, right? Short answer is 25, 30 years of slogging hard work, right? There's no such thing as just showing up to a constituency and saying, at least on your own. I mean, you might do it if a party supports you, if there's a wave, whatever, right? So that's the blunt truth about politics. I mean, my favorite line from Max Weber, it's the slow boring of hard words. There's no quick fix, right? But going back to the knowledge point, so at one level, I think a lot of our conversations are mediated by, as we call it, these presuppositions, these anxieties, which we don't have a way of talking about. But there's a second kind of problem, I think, in our knowledge conversations, which I think we are all to blame for more collectively, by meaning those who claim to produce knowledge and argue public policy, the Takshilas and the CPRs of the world, right? And that problem is the following. I think it's a cliche to say that a lot of research and propositions are very ideologically motivated. Often people's answer to the question even before the question has been asked, and that's often a bad sign in an intellectual, right? Unfortunately, I think we have too many of those. I think we have too few genuine doubting Thomases in the system. Everybody has too many answers, right? But more importantly, and for public policy purposes, this is, I think the issue, one way of putting it. So let us take one example. Again, it's a very stylized example. Let us say you have two views on how to deliver primary school education to kids. Right? You may want a voucher system, right? Or you may want a public school system. Now, one level of argument which we have too much of is that very high level. Public voucher system has choice, it's a reaction against the failures of the public system, all of that stuff, right? And then the public guys come back and say, but how do you create a common school system? Voucher systems will inscribe inequality, right? There's that level of argumentation is very important. The level of argumentation we don't have enough of is the careful, very careful and rigorous working out of, okay, let us say you were to do a public system and let us say you were to do a voucher system. What are all the conditions that would have to be in place for that system to work in its own terms? Right? So arguably for a public system, some would say, you would have to have the ability to take on unions. If you would take on teachers' unions, maybe you can make it work. Some would make that case, right? For a private system, voucher-based system, you would certainly have to reform your land markets, zoning laws, the political economy of that, for you to be assured that there can be an adequate supply response in case you kind of move, right? Both are pre-con, right? What we don't debate enough about is which of these, at that level of specificity, are you better likely to institutionalize and you can do. Right? I mean, as Keynes used to say, all the devil is not just in the detail, but also in the precondition. Every proposition in public policy is conditional. Under certain conditions, this proposition is true. Right? Take another. I just use the education stuff because it's just easier, and the people here are much more knowledgeable about education. But I've been looking at some of this stuff, for example, on private schools, primary schools, right? And clearly, there's a private school revolution underway. There's absolutely no question about it, which hopefully RT. There's a danger that RT could actually kill it, right? Now, we can debate in the abstract whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But let us say it is a fact. Let us also stipulate that, even though the actual test results are mixed between public and private, it's not clear that there's a huge superiority. But let us even stipulate that the privatization has yielded some dividends. UP, 80% urban UP private schools, right? 35%, rural rising, right? Then you ask this question. So government looks at this. Some people in government look at this and say, there's been a private supply response. Let's do this for secondary schools as well, right? Okay. Now, plausible idea. I mean, if you can, your first instinct might be to say if it can work for private, why can't it work for secondary?